My grandfather was a fisherman and fished all his life out of the east part of the St. John's Harbour. His name was Joseph Peckford, and he's one of my heroes. And he was a hard-working person. He went out to the seal fishery for 49 years in a row. Was on 2 or 3 sealing disasters. I remember him primarily because of his hard work and because of his entrepreneurship and because of his independence and because he was an individual. Because he figured he had individual rights back in another age, in another time. So I recognize and think about him a lot when I get into people like this. Canada was formed in 1867, as we know today, as a nation. It was formed in 1867 by a piece of legislation called the British North America Act. Okay? That's how Canada came together. And there was only 4 units. It was Upper Canada, which was Ontario, Lower Canada, which was Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. They were the only 4 units that came together which formed Canada in 1867. We now have 10 provinces and 3 territories. So it enlarged after 1867. And in that, it defined Canada and that it was a federation, not a unitary state like England or France. There was a federal government, and then there were 4 then at the time provinces. And they divided the powers up between the federal government and the provinces. Very important for you to remember this as we go down this little memory lane for a few minutes, okay? So it's a federation or a confederation, like the United States, like Germany, like Australia, even like Switzerland, and that's perhaps the most decentralized federation in the whole world. The cantons in Switzerland still have perhaps more powers than the provinces of Canada have. So a very different kind of confederation, and more loose than this one. As a matter of fact, I always tell the story about when we were negotiating as it relates to the Constitution with Mr. Trudeau and the other 9 premiers. One of the things he used to hate about me was the fact that he would say, what you guys are talking about, you're going to balkanize the country. And some of you older folks, if you remember that time, he said that on TV quite a bit at the time, balkanize, and that was supposed to be a really dirty word. All it meant is that we were going to share powers, and that we already are sharing powers under the Constitution before he was born. And so when he would say, we're going to balkanize the country, in other words, the provinces are going to assert the power they already had, I would speak up and say, well, how about Switzerland, sir? And he would go bonkers. Because Switzerland was a very successful country, and yet they had very decentralized powers. So if Switzerland can do it, why couldn't Canada? So he didn't like that very much. Anyway, the one thing missing in this very foundational document was no individual rights or freedoms. There was none. From 1867 until 1960, Canadians lived from an individual rights point of view off the fact of British common law and precedents that were set over the years. So the Constitution of Canada after 1867 to 1960 consisted of the BNA Act, British common law, and custom. And so if you had an individual right issue, you would have to rely, or your lawyer would have to rely upon not the BNA Act. There was nothing in there that would help you. You had to rely upon common law, which was unwritten, and customs that built up over the years after 1867. After the Second World War, there was some movement by some people in the country, in Canada, to try to change that and to put more things down so that when you go to court, you had a better chance of winning your individual right litigation. You had a better chance because it was written, as opposed to depending upon various precedents in common law that could waver over time in the various cases that came before them. And every case is not the same. That's the other problem with not having something written down. But nothing was done until 1960. And there was, let me put it to you this way, there was an acknowledgement that there should be some individual rights and freedoms in our Constitution or in our legislation. And so Prime Minister John Diefenbaker of Saskatchewan introduced into the House of Commons the Bill of Rights in 1960. Now, Mr. Diefenbaker is to be given full credit for acknowledging and understanding that there was such a thing as individual rights and freedoms for individuals living in a state, in a country. However, and this is very important for everybody to understand, because the last thing you want to do in this fight that we're in now is to go down rabbit holes, okay? Because you're going to go nowhere, okay? So it's very important. So when people talk to me and say to me, "But we got the Bill of Rights," I want to remind you, this was just an act of Parliament. Remember the separation of powers a few minutes ago? So this only applied to the federal government and its employees. It was a federal law. But it did acknowledge rights and freedoms for the individual. That's what's really important about it. And it's still there on the books now. But after and of course it's a federal act of the House of Commons, so it could be changed at any time at the whim of any federal government. They had a majority of seats, or could get a majority of seats in the House of Commons. Then this could be changed at any time at the whim of any politician or group of politicians. So it had no real permanence to it, did it? As we know, governments, especially today in the last decade or two, changing laws at their whim, as they are right now, causing the problems that we have in our country, because that's what's happened. They're changing and using laws, not going back to Parliament, adding more regulation to a given statute rather than go back to Parliament and face the people's house. And that's one of our problems.